Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Yasmina Greco. I'm with O'Reilly Media, and I will be your host for today's webcast. Today, folks, we have Ash Maurya presenting How Lean Startups Define, Measure, and Communicate Progress. Ash is the founder of UserCycle. Since bootstrapping his last company 7 years ago, he has launched 5 products and 1 peer-to-web application framework. Throughout this time, he has been in search of better, faster ways for building successful products. Ash has more recently been rigorously applying customer development and lean startup techniques to his products, which he frequently writes about on his blog, ashmaurya.com, and which turned into a book, Running Lean. Folks, we're really excited to have Ash with us today to present this webcast for you all. As we get things started, I'd like to go over a little housekeeping to help you get the most out of today's webcast. You'll want to open your group chat widget if you haven't already done so. This is where we can interact with each other during the event and where you can submit your questions for Ash. We find that our audience usually has a lot of good knowledge to share, so we encourage you all to chat freely during the event. However, if you have questions for Ash, please preface them with a capital letter Q so we know that they're for him and we can make sure he sees it for Q&A. You can also open, move, and resize any of the other widgets. If you'd like to tweet from the Twitter widget today, you may need to give it permission to access your account. The Twitter widget will automatically append the event's hashtag to your tweet so you don't have to. And today, our hashtag is Lean Startup, all one word. If you should have any problems during the event, please take a look at your help widget. If you continue to have trouble, just post it in the group chat and one of our staff will help you right away. If you experience choppy audio or stalled visuals, try refreshing your window. And remember, the best thing you can do for a good audio stream is to close any apps that could interfere. People always ask, so we'd like you to know we are recording today's webcast, and we'll have the archive ready usually within 48 hours. And folks, at this time, it is my pleasure to turn the program over to Ash for his presentation. Hello, Ash.
Thank you very much, Yasmina. Hello, everyone, and thanks for being here today. So my plan for today is to quickly walk through some content from the book, but so I'm going to walk through some slides and mostly introduce some newer concepts I've been working on since the book, and builds up on a lot of the concepts that are mentioned in there. And then I'll take the rest of the time to answer as many questions as we can fit in. That's usually the more fun part of these webinars. So probably spend about 25, 30 minutes with slides and then spend the rest of the time with questions. So I'd like to start off with first summarizing the conceptual framework behind running lean, or the conceptual framework that it introduces. So the big problem that the book aims to tackle is that building products is hard. Building successful products is a very hard problem. And so it suggests using the lean startup customer development techniques to decompose the problem into smaller, more manageable pieces. So the first step in that conceptual framework is one of documenting your plan A. And there's this Lean Canvas business model tool that I covered last time in the webinar and talked a lot about in my blog and in the book. But it's a way of capturing your business model on a single page. So you start with that. You document your initial plan. Then the next step of that process is identifying what's riskiest on that plan. And the reason we want to start with what's risky is because we don't want to necessarily tackle what's easy. If you were building a complex product, you wouldn't start with the easy stuff first given a deadline. You'd want to tackle the more risky stuff first so that at the end of the project you're not thrashing like mad. You want to do most of that thrashing up front. So that's why we want to identify what's risky, and then we run a set of experiments. And if you're familiar with Lean and Lean Startup, you will recognize that picture. It's a picture Eric Ries drew about 3 years ago, the build, measure, learn loop. So we run a set of experiments, and we want to keep these experiments small and fast. And from there, every experiment ends in learning. So we use that learning to update our understanding of risks. And then there's a feedback loop that goes back all the way to our vision. So we come back and we refine our vision over time. So unlike a traditional model of traditional waterfall-like model of having a business plan, a business model, and then just executing it to completion, there's a realization that most plans will change along the way. And so this is a more iterative, staged approach for building a plan that works. So this was a conceptual model that I describe in the book. And since putting it out there, I frequently get lots and lots of questions. And so there are a lot of these how-to questions, how do I questions that I'm going to answer, or aim to answer today. The first is, how do you correctly prioritize and define experiments? So many people do a good job of capturing that initial business model. Some of them do a good job of getting to the risks, but they're not quite sure which are the top risks. So how do you prioritize risks, and then how do you define experiments to go test them? Finally, how do you track these experiments so they scale both over time and as the team grows? So even for myself, I started a lot of my own experiments as a solo founder, and eventually grew the team to being a lot more people involved in the process. And with each additional person that you add in, it becomes important to have a way to communicate what is risky, what are the experiments, what are the expectations. So we'll talk about things like that. And then finally, when do you go back to the canvas and reflect those learnings? So there's a tendency of having this initial plan A documented, like a business plan, and then you go off and run experiments, and you don't quite know at what point do you come back and update it. When is that learning complete? When is it done? But when do you actually make those kinds of changes? So I'll touch on some of those ideas as well today. And so essentially what today's talk is going to be about is going a level deeper and talking about how we put a lot of that conceptual framework to practice. And down below, I kind of use this term, innovation accounting, and it's not a term that I coined. Again, Eric Ries, in his book, The Lean Startup, first introduced this concept. And I really like the play of both words, because innovation on one side seems to suggest something that's creative, new, kind of unknown, and accounting is the boring side, the more predictable side. And putting the two terms together was something Eric did on purpose, because they're much like we have a lot of financial accounting tools and financial systems to measure the progress of more established companies. We need something similar in place to be able to measure the progress of startups and new products where there may be no revenue metrics, there may be no clear metrics to begin with. And so how do you wade through that qualitative, almost uncertain phase of those products? So that's why I really like that term, and that's why I kind of labeled this presentation Innovation Accounting, because a lot of it falls under that umbrella. So if I was to define what innovation accounting helps you do, at the heart of it is those three things that Yasmina started out with. It helps you define progress, it helps you measure it, and then communicate it both with internal and external stakeholders. So there's a place for it even when you talk to investors and you talk to advisors. There's these tools that I'll share with you today can be very effective at communicating exactly what you are doing with your products and the progress that you're making. So before we get into that, I'll kind of share this other framework. So typically when I talk about entrepreneurs getting hit by ideas, I talk about one of the mistakes they make is falling in love with their solution, falling in love with their idea. We can actually decompose that even further. When entrepreneurs get hit by an idea, it comes as a singular signal, but you can break it into these three components of a pyramid. There's the vision at the lowest level, there's the strategy, and then at the very top you have the product, which is the thing that the entrepreneur then goes out to build. And the mistake that many entrepreneurs often make is that they fall in love with the product prematurely. And so they don't take enough time building that solid foundation of vision and strategy, and they rush up this pyramid and start executing on the product too early, only to find that maybe they had certain assumptions which were not going to hold true, and they've actually spent time, money, effort building a product that probably not enough people, or in the worst case, nobody really wants. And so this just goes back to the foundational pieces. If you don't have that strong vision and strategy, then it doesn't matter what you build, because you will succeed in building that thing that you build, but it may not be the optimal business model that you had in mind. So with that, I'll kind of share this more I'll kind of build on this example more using a driving metaphor. So if you were planning a road trip, the vision would be much like your destination. You have to have a clear success metric or a clear destination in mind, and ideally have a time frame for it. So I oftentimes ask entrepreneurs to start with the why question, which is, why this business model, why them, why these customers. You can ask a lot of deep questions just to weed out business models. And there really isn't a right or wrong answer. Some entrepreneurs do it to learn. Other entrepreneurs do it to make a lot of money. And the question of how much is a lot of money is also varying. It also varies from entrepreneur to entrepreneur. So just asking that deep why question gets you at least to put a time box on what your success metric needs to be. And then you need to move to that next level, which is if you were taking this road trip, there are lots of ways to get from point A to point B. You want to be able to chart out what those possible ways are and which ones might be more optimal given your constraints, your time constraints. So in a road trip kind of analogy, you might choose to bike, you might choose to walk, you might choose to fly, take the train, and each one will have different criteria. And you're not quite sure which is the optimal one, so you start trying a number of them and through experiments in the lean sense. And that would be the strategies that you would try to get to the final product, which would be a repeatable roadmap. So now if you want to take that trip again, you would know that with these particular options, you would have a higher likely chance of achieving the goal of reaching your destination within the constraints that you set for yourself. And the same kind of metaphor applies to entrepreneurs as well. So you have to have a clear destination. There are lots of ways to go kind of get from point A to point B, and I'll talk a little bit more about strategy here in a second. And then while you're testing out your strategy, you're actually testing not just one product, but you're potentially building multiple layers of products. And that's the concept at the very earliest level. You're looking in search of the minimum viable product, and once that is built, you then layer it on top with more features, more functionality to become a fully functioning product that now can scale and address the customer need and the customer problems that you set out to solve. So again, this is another conceptual model. If we shift this, there's this new set of tools that I've started popularizing or started talking about, and it's something I call the lean stack. So in the book, I introduced the lean canvas. The lean stack builds on top of that. So at the very lowest level, we have the vision, which is still captured by the lean canvas, and it's an effective way of capturing your one-page business model, your one-page vision of what it is that you want to do. I'm assuming that a lot of you have seen this already, so I'm not going to cover this entirely. I will say that I find a number of people taking too much time in building their initial canvases. And one thing that I do want to stress is that there is a strong emphasis in the lean approach to seek more empirical evidence than do a lot of analysis of your business models. So if you spend a lot of analysis, you get into the analysis paralysis trap. And while you can sit with a business model for weeks and sometimes even months in hand just trying to perfect it on paper, the true answers lie outside the building. So you really have to get out there. And so I recently created a set of videos, and one of them, there's a link on here that I just put up, which is this 20-minute lean canvas challenge. And so I oftentimes challenge people to create their initial business model in just 20 minutes. And it's not so much about getting it perfect or right, because it is going to change, but about taking that brain dump, taking a snapshot of what's in your mind and laying it out on paper. And so 20 minutes should be plenty of time to do that. And if you're interested in taking that challenge, you can go to that link there. So that was the initial canvas portion. Now, last time when I was on the webcast as well, I used strategy, and I talked about Facebook as an example of how strategy matters. So if we look at Facebook versus other social networks, the vision wasn't really unique. Facebook necessarily didn't have a different vision from the MySpaces of the world, the LinkedIns of the world. They all wanted to build a social network. They all wanted to connect everyone on this planet, essentially. And they all had similar approaches or similar visions of what they wanted to achieve. But what Facebook did very differently is their rollout was completely different. Rather than trying to build a brand new social network, they went after pre-existing social networks, and they started at very small places like a college campus. Rather than opening it up to everyone, they used that as a way to build and test at small scale first. But on the side, one of the side effects of that is that they created very cohesive social networks, because those social networks already existed. They just took them from offline to online. And then they either stumbled into this or it was by design. I don't know because I was not working in Facebook, but they built this pent-up desire and exclusivity because they were going after certain schools and other schools wanted them, and so they used that as a pretty effective strategy to roll out their network so that by the time it was out, everyone wanted to be in Facebook, and they very quickly connected up the schools and then eventually companies and eventually other people that are using Facebook today. And so I would say that what made Facebook win, they weren't the first. They didn't have access to more capital. They didn't have access to unfair advantages when they started out. It was really their rollout strategy that really made that difference. And so this is a board that we've been playing with at Spark 59, where I work now. We've been playing with a board to be able to capture the strategy down and to be able to play around with different rollout approaches. And so I'll kind of walk through this because at first sight this may seem a little daunting because it's something new again. And there's on the upper right-hand side, there's something called the analog and then the antilog. And so I'll start there and define what that is. So the concept of the analog and antilog was something that was introduced by Randy Komisar and John Mullins in their book, Getting to Plan B. And it's not a foreign concept. It may be a new term for many of you, but it's a pretty common thing that we do anyways. And that is we look around and we look at people that have tried to do things that we are trying to achieve, and we look at those that succeeded. So that would be the analog examples, and then we look at those people that failed, so those companies that failed, and that would be the antilog examples. The reason we want to do this is we want to learn from the successes and or failures of others. We want to, much like in science, we want to stand on the shoulders of giants and be able to not repeat the same mistakes or not go validate the same things that have already been done. And this may still be a little abstract, so I'll share an example here in a second. But once you have a good set of analogs and antilogs, you can extract a design pattern for your rollout strategy. So if I were to use Facebook as an example, there are two ways. There are probably many ways, but I'll just use two ways of building a social network. There's the Facebook approach, which is start in a pre-existing social network, for example, in a college campus, and then use exclusivity, desire to roll out, and then scale it out to everyone incrementally over time. That's approach A, and you can say there's one design pattern there. The second approach might be the LinkedIn approach, which is open to everyone else and make it easy for them to invite colleagues. The other people use email as a way to build these social networks up. There are lots of different patterns that you can extract from what has worked and not worked and decide which one works for you. So that's the concept of using the analogs, antilogs to get to that design strategy. And another kind of example that I'll share with you here is the Apple iPod example. So when Apple was designing the iPod, they didn't have to ask, would people carry music in their pocket? That question had already been answered decades before by Sony when they invented the Walkman. So in the analog section, there's this little black box, which is supposed to be a Sony Walkman. It may not be coming in that clear. So they didn't have to ask that question. They also didn't have to ask, would people consume individual soundtracks? And that question had already been answered also by Napster, because they had proven that people would break the CD bundling and consume songs one at a time. So both Napster and Sony in this case would serve as analogs to Apple's iPod. But interestingly enough, Napster also served as an antilog. So many of you probably know what happened to Napster. They're not around anyway in that same form. So even though they got a lot of people to download the music, they did this without the permission of record labels who held the rights to the music. And so they essentially took Napster to court and eventually shut them down. So that would be an example of a bad thing that Napster did, and so that's an example of an antilog. So the music industry was ripe for disruption, though, and Apple decided to wait. So when they initially launched the iPod, they didn't have the music store, and what we know going back in time is that the music store concept was being developed at the same time as the iPod. It just was not going to be launched because from a strategic implementation perspective, the right thing to do was to get the record labels on your side first. So going without them would have been a mistake. So even though the music industry was ripe for disruption, Apple waited a couple years to launch their music store and they spend a considerable amount of time first negotiating what has now become the famous 99 cents a song pricing model. And so that's just a very simple example of how you can use analogs and analogs to learn from what has worked and what hasn't worked, and then formulate a simple strategy. So this was a very simple example just to illustrate that. Now, oftentimes people have no trouble finding analogs because you can look around. If you've been in an industry for a while, you can see companies that have succeeded, and you can find analogs. Analogs are sometimes a little bit harder to find. And so that's a common question I get. And so the answer there is that if you've been around that problem domain for a while, you've probably lived through these, and you can glean from the successes and failures of others that have come before you. Other times you have to do some level of what I call forensic research. And so one of the tools that I like to use a lot is the Internet Archive, so the Wayback Machine. And for those of you that don't know what this is, it's basically an archive of a lot of web pages that are already out there. You can just type in a URL and go back in time and see what they look like. And so if you take a popular product like Basecamp, built by 37 Signals, if you go to their website today, you'll see something that looks like this. And if you blindly try to copy what they're doing today, it probably won't help you, because they're a much more mature company now than you probably are, and they have certain unfair advantages that they've built up over a decade. So it's more valuable not to study what they're doing today, but what they might have done when they were starting out. So if you look at this page, you might say, well, this is pretty well designed. They're using certain tactics. They're using social proof. I'll just go copy these things. And you may get some mixed results. And a lot of people say that one of 37 Signals' big unfair advantage is their design and simplicity. But if you go back in time, this is really what their pages looked like when they first started out. By browsing through these pages, kind of early 2001, 2003, you can see how they built up their brand. You'll see they had a blog which had few readers at first, but it became pretty popular, and that's how they really launched their brand, and the products really followed after that. So it was not a product-led strategy, but a content marketing-led strategy. So again, those are the kind of things you learn by going back in time and gleaning from why things succeeded versus just looking at the success at the end and just trying to copy that at the tactical level. So it's from those pages, not what you see today, that you might be able to draw that meaningful strategy, which would be applicable to a product that you might be looking to build. If we come back to the board, at the lower level, we have these risks sections, and I'm not going to walk through them. It's essentially like a getting things done board or a Kanban board where you've got a backlog of risks, and you place the risks on there, and you can kind of walk them through the board. So you've got your strategy, and then you've got your top risks. I do want to talk about a distinction between risk and uncertainty. So a lot of times people look at everything in their business model, everything on the canvas as being risky, and they start tackling everything at once. And that's a mistake because it overwhelms you, and it's hard to really focus that way. And so I mentioned how you have to start with what is riskiest first. So I'll draw that distinction here. So if we look at uncertainty versus risk, yes, everything on the canvas is uncertain, but uncertain doesn't necessarily mean high risk. So a state of uncertainty just means you're not sure what could possibly happen. There could be two possible outcomes or three possible outcomes on any situation. So people may pay you, people may not pay you. You may have customer segment A or customer segment B. You're not sure which one would be the right one to go pursue. But if we shift over to the risk side, what risks do is they attach a value to the uncertainty. So if that uncertainty were to come true, if the worst was to happen, you put a value to it. And that's how you prioritize high risk versus low risk. So a lot of things are uncertain. For example, will people pay me or not? That's something that could be uncertain with my product, but it also is high risk, because if people don't pay me for my product, then I have no business model. I have no business building this thing. It's not a problem worth solving. So that is probably one of those things I would say is very high risk. A slight variant of that is how much they pay me may also be uncertain. Will they pay me, $90 or $100 or $200? That may be uncertain, but at the stage that I'm in, that may not be the highest risk. It is more important for me to go determine whether customers will pay me versus not, and then do the optimization on the price a little bit later. So that's an example where once I've determined that people will pay me something, as long as I'm within a particular price ballpark and it's fair enough, I probably wouldn't invest a lot of time trying to optimize that price point. I would instead move to other things that may be higher risk. Hopefully that example made sense. So that's how I would look at risk versus uncertainty. The last board that I just want to quickly cover, and then we'll shift to questions, is the experiments board. And so I'll share some concepts around crafting effective experiments. And this is one of the more complicated boards. And so maybe one thing I should have prefaced from the start is that these boards are meant to be exercises. I was doing a lot of these exercises kind of in my head when I was initially running my first set of experiments. But as people came on the team, it became important to share those mental leaps of that thought process. So these boards are a way of being able to do those kinds of things. So whether you actually rigorously practice using these boards, which is getting poster versions or online versions of these, or you actually still do them in your head, but you're still able to articulate what's the thought process behind why something is risky versus not, is the message I want to really share with you today. So it's not so much about the boards, but kind of the thinking behind them. So I'll start off by, many of you know what an experiment is, so I'm not going to walk through that. It's maybe at a high level, it's a cycle around this loop. So you start with ideas, you build some aspect of your product, you put it in front of customers, and you collect both qualitative, quantitative data, and it should end in learning at the end, ideally customer learning. And so there are three aspects that are critical when you're designing experiments. One is you want to make them as fast as possible. So you want to reduce scope of what you build so that you can go around this loop as many times as possible before running out of resources, and you want to do it as quickly as possible. At the end of every one of those experiment loops, you have to end with learning. If you don't learn anything, then the experiment isn't finished yet. It was not an experiment to begin with. It may have just been a project that you built. So it has to end with learning. And then something I stress a lot about is that focus. If you're not focused on the right risk items, you may run a lot of experiments, you may be learning, but you're not going to necessarily have the fastest forward-moving progress because you're probably helping mitigate aspects of your business model, and a good example might be that price optimization. You might determine that maybe $99.8 is the right optimal price for your product, but you might do that at the expense of building channels. So you may have converted only 10 people, but you failed to drive more traffic to your site. So at the end, that would have been the better place to put your effort. So I'll share some thoughts on what matters when you're crafting experiments, because this is something that I get asked a lot, and even I know last time there were some questions on this. So the first thing that I want to share is that there's a natural tension between, on the one hand, keeping your experiments small and fast, and on the other hand, expecting them to uncover these big breakthrough insights. You'll probably never run a single experiment that completely de-risks your entire business model. So experiments shouldn't be really treated as standalone monolithic projects, but rather they're these small projects that you string together, and the key part here is making the learning additive. So experiments are not standalone, but additive. That's the first thing that I wanted to share with you. And the three stages that I talk a lot about illustrate that additive process. So if I get hit by an idea, the first thing I want to do is test the problem, the problem and customer segment. The first question I want to answer is this a problem worth solving? And that's the first series of experiments that I run. And from that learning, I would then move into the solution value testing phase, which would be the second stage, and then finally into growth. And trying to do these out of order is, again, just going to lead to suboptimal results. If I have not validated that I've got the right customers and problems to solve, just building a solution and putting it out there is going to be suboptimal. I'd much rather spend time trying to get that first part right. So each of these stages is additive and builds on the previous stage. And so that's kind of kind of goes in line with the experiments being additive. The next principle is that the expected outcomes of your experiments needs to be declared up front. And this one rule is very important because you've probably seen this from Eric before. If you simply plan on seeing what happens, you'll always succeed because something will happen. And if you couple this with the fact that as entrepreneurs, we are reasonably smart, at least we like to think we are, and we can rationalize whatever happens, whether it's good or bad, to fit our own mental models or what we'd call the reality distortion field, and we convince ourselves that we're on the right track. So if you couple those two things, it's very important to make those declarations up front. And then simply stating those expected outcomes is not enough. You also have to state it in a falsifiable hypothesis form, which I know is a kind of a big fancy word. It's taken right out of the scientific method. So I'll define what it is. a falsifiable hypothesis is a statement that you should be able to prove incorrect. You should be able to disprove or prove false. And this is a necessary condition when setting up an experiment. If you don't do that, it's very easy to fall into the inductivist error trap, and you always convince yourself you're on the right track again. So just two examples here. If you look at this statement above, here I believe that I'm quote-unquote an expert on something, and I'll be able to drive early adopters to my product. And I might do a number of things to test this belief. I might write a blog post or speak or send out a Twitter update announcing my product. But at the end of the day, I'm not quite sure when this hypothesis is validated. Is it when I get 10 people to sign up, 100 or 1,000 people? It's not really very clear. And because of that, I can declare success at any point. As long as I get one person to sign up, I could say, see, this person signed up because I just told them to. And so I am an expert. And that's the problem with this kind of an approach, is that it's too vague at this level. Here's that same belief turned into something that's more testable and specific. So this time I'm going to take a very specific action, which in this case is writing a blog post. And as a result of that action, I expect to see 100 signups. So this time I clearly know how to both measure and declare success. And so this is a formula that I kind of suggest using, and there's a little typo at the end. It should say specific repeatable action will yield to expected measurable outcome. But if you use this fragment, it's a good way to start thinking in terms of that falsifiable hypothesis sense. So you want to take your theory or your belief and turn it into something that you can go and do. So you have the action side, and then something that you can measure to see if that actually worked or not. Now, as simple as it sounds, I find many people reluctant to make these predictions, and I found there are generally two reasons for this. The first is that people hate to be proven wrong, and this one is just kind of inherent in human nature. We often have our personal egos attached to our products. I know it's hard to really offer an easy solution here. It's easy for me to say, don't do this, but that's not going to be good enough. But all I can say is that the whole process is fundamentally about being less wasteful. But the irony is that you can't really appreciate what waste really is unless you've been wasteful before. So sometimes you have to be wasteful, and I often let people come around to this kind of thinking just really on their own. So at some point, there is this kind of in the entrepreneur life cycle, there is this point where you start to detach your personal ego from the product and realize that there is this bigger goal that is outside your own product preconceptions. And so you start to realize that there is more to just holding on to those blind faith kind of assumptions, the passion, determination argument, and there is more value in being empirical and objective. And so that's when you start making these kinds of declarations, as uncomfortable as they may feel at first. The second reason, though, people are uncomfortable is that these predictions are hard to make because you oftentimes don't have enough information to make them. And that is just the world of building new products. It's conditions of extreme uncertainty. So you do have to be comfortable, despite that. So when you do start out, your judgment is going to be all off. You're going to be repeatedly making overly optimistic predictions and be completely wrong most of the times. And all of that is okay. The good news is that over time, you'll begin to understand your business better, and your judgment will improve. And it only improves by going through this process. So I've talked about falsifiable hypotheses and why they're critical. You have to be able to state it in that way so you know whether you were successful or not with an experiment. But what happens when you don't have enough data either way? So what happens if in my last example, after the first week, I got exactly 60 signups. It wasn't 100 signups. It wasn't 0 signups. So it was something in the middle. The natural tendency here is to want to just wait another week longer. And then pretty soon we started rationalizing extending the timeline even more. Those weeks can start turning into months, and we want to avoid that trap. So in a startup, all resources are important, but time is the scarcest resource we have. All the other resources, money, people, can fluctuate up and down, but time is the one that we never get back. So we do want to emphasize time as being that most valuable resource. And for that reason, it brings us to the principle number 4, which is we want to clearly time box our experiments. We want to make sure that we have falsifiable hypotheses, but we also put a time limit on them. So in my blog post example, if I put a 2-week limit on my blog post, having the results after 2 weeks, I could clearly go and measure whether I hit my 100 sign-up limit or not. And again, the time box here may not be perfect. You may actually need more time to collect data because for legitimate reasons, and that again is okay. So your judgment is not going to always be correct, even with making those time predictions. But the important thing here is that after those 2 weeks, there is this decision point where you pause and reflect on the status of an experiment, and then you decide collectively whether more time is needed or whether this experiment is on track or not, and you make that decision with more reason than just wishful thinking. So that brings us to the last point, which I touched on last time as well, but I'm going to cover it once again because it is a big point. And it's one of experiment failure. So when experiments fail, many entrepreneurs run away from that failure and they quickly change direction and they justify it as a pivot, which in the lean startup world has become this overly abused term. And if you go back to the definition of a pivot, it's really a change in strategy. So when I'm showing you the product vision strategy pyramid, when you change strategies, that's really when you're pivoting. And that change has to be grounded in learning. Otherwise, it's just a see what sticks strategy, which is not, again, very optimal at finding what's really going to work. And so I oftentimes like to use successful company trajectories, which is this hockey stick curve. And there's this very flat part in the beginning. And it's not flat because the founders were too dumb or not working hard. It's just that before you can find something that's going to take off, you have to go through a lot of stuff that just plain isn't. And that's just kind of the nature of it. So I really like this quote. And so the answer here isn't running away from failed experiments. It's actually redefining them to being unexpected outcomes. And rather than running away from them, digging deeper and trying to get to that root cause of the failure. So if you made a deadline prediction and it was off, you still call that experiment as not successful, but you want to figure out why didn't we get results in the time box that we had set. Was it just that we guessed incorrectly, or was there something more at hand? If you don't get the results you expect, similarly, you want to dig deeper, and from that learning, you build the next set of experiments. So if I was to put this on the board, after this we'll switch over to questions. This is how experiments might play out. So they would be this would be your product card, which would be the title of what you're trying to do, and it's broken by stages. I'm not going to walk through each of these stages. I'll just show you one of them. So I might have a product card. I might have a particular goal. So in my problem solution fit stage, I want to be able to go and determine for myself whether this customer segment A is a viable customer segment and whether the problems I have in mind are going to be the right ones. And so I'm testing a number of different assumptions here. And the way I put that on the card is I do want to define what my exit criteria is. It might be go and interview 10 customers and get 80% of them to give me a verbal commitment. It might be something more stronger. It might be go and interview 20 people and get 80% of them to prepay for my product. Or whatever that success criteria is, I want to clearly define it along with the due date. So I've got my exit criteria. Then I would set up a number of experiments. And here too you've got the falsifiable hypothesis, which describes your exit criteria in a time box. But before I get to that, there's this concept of the work in progress limit. And so the idea behind that is that you don't want to be running hundreds of experiments either. So if you're a team of just 3 people, I would say start with just one experiment among yourselves, and over time begin to figure out how many additional experiments can your team really handle. So that a key principle here is finishing your experiments to completion before starting the next one, and that's what this limit really helps enforce. So you're in many ways capping how many things you can do at any given time, so you're not doing a lot of things just half complete. And so when you do define the experiment, similarly to the product card, you've got this falsifiable hypothesis, which I've talked about, and that helps to define it helps to declare how you will define success if you see it. If this experiment were to succeed, what that would be, and then what is that time box for when you expect to see that success by. And so you make those 2 declarations up front. And then that would be your experiment setup. You may have to do other work to build something. You may have to build a landing page, or you have to build some feature. So you're going to be doing that in that build stage. Then once the experiment gets first put in front of customers, you get into that measure part of the loop. So that's the first customer interaction. And then finally, it will move into the learning stage. And it can move there for 2 reasons. One is you've achieved your falsifiable hypothesis, or the other is that you ran out of time. And in both of those instances, you would pause to reflect on what you learned, and based on that, you would move on to crafting the next experiment. And so a good cadence for that is 2 weeks. I kind of throw that out there because anything less is possible, but it becomes too fast-paced when you're first trying out the process. And anything longer becomes too long where you can actually lose interest and not really follow through with this kind of thought exercise. So picking an experiment that can fit within 2 weeks, like building a landing page and going and interviewing people, is a great place to get started with something like this. So with that, actually before I switch to questions, I was initially going to cover I was going to cover a case study on how we put some of the stuff to practice. Instead of covering that, because I did want to save time for questions, I just put a link here. You can go and it's a series of videos that I recorded. There's a talk that I did at the Lean Startup Conference, and then a set of videos that came after it that go into more detail on what these different boards are and how you can think of innovation accounting and the canvassing and how it all fits together, experiment design. But with that, I will switch over to Yasmina, and we can take questions.
Thank you so much, Ash, for yet another fantastic webcast today. Folks, we are at Q&A. As you heard, please open that group chat widget. If you didn't already do it, type your question in, send it in, and Ash will answer it while he's with us. Okay, let's take them in the order they are coming in. We have a question from Rachel. She says, Ash, what do you think of the Alistair Kroll-Ben Yaskovitz lean analytics concept of the one metric that matters? Only care about one metric at a time.
I'm a big believer of that, and so when I've read the books, I was an early reviewer, and I think it's a great book, so definitely go buy it. But the other thing is the whole one metric that matters concept is a very powerful one, and even in some of those videos that I say you should go watch, I do kind of reinforce that. So maybe I'll preface that by saying that it's not one metric at the expense of others. So what I usually recommend people do, and I think that's the same message that Ben and Alistair are also sharing in the book, is that you do want to model the entire customer life cycle. So I'm a big proponent of Dave McClure's startup metrics model. So the approach that I take is modeling the entire customer life cycle. So I look at everything from acquisition, so when people might hit a website, to them activating, using the product, coming back, using it, buying it. So you want to look at all of those metrics. But when you're going to optimize and you're going to improve one, it is most effective to think of it in terms of just one metric and having your whole team pick that one enemy or that one thing to go optimize first. But again, never at the expense. So something that I do share in the case study is that when you go into just the narrow optimization of one metric, it can be at the expense of others. I've seen many instances where you can improve your retention, you can make something more engaging at the expense of people buying your product. So you've distracted them now. They're having so much fun with your product they forget to buy. So you do have to model the entire customer life cycle and always monitor the entire one. But I do think that it's very effective to focus on one metric at a time.
Great, thank you. Oh, and Rachel sends a note saying thank you for the answer there. Okay, next question from Dietrich. Help me understand how the lean canvas differs, compares, or feeds the business model canvas.
Yeah, so I'll give you the short answer, and there's a long answer is on my blog. So I get this question a lot. So the short answer is that I started out with the business model canvas, and I built many products. And so what I found is that because of the boxes that were on there, things like key activities and key partners, I found a lot of overlap. And I was really looking, as you can see, I place a lot of emphasis on focus and identifying the right risks. So I wanted to create I wanted the canvas to really show me what I needed to be working on in terms of risks and outline and highlight those for me. So there were a lot of things like on the main canvas, which I felt, while important, were either latter stage or were more important for other people looking at the canvas. And so I built one more from an entrepreneurial kind of mindset, or the entrepreneur mindset, and use a lot of the lean startup methodology. So problem, solution, key metrics are blocks that I wanted to highlight. So as I said, there is a much longer blog post on why I made specific changes. So it's always hard to take out things. So the blog post goes into why I took out things and what I added. And I'll actually paste the link into the Q&A section, into the chat window here in a second. So we could move on to the next question in the meanwhile.
Okay. Next question here from Emilio. He asks, is innovation accounting mainly useful for the startup second phase once the MVP has already been launched?
So again, depending on how you would on how you define innovation accounting. So there's various levels. So I would say that going to your point, the first phase tends to be very qualitative. We still use the board concept. So we would still, I work with many entrepreneurs, and I make them, I hold them accountable to those experiment declarations. And I'll give you an example here. So even before you launch, you might say, I need to go find 10 customers that will buy my product. And I'm going to do this before I build the MVP. So you're going to go through a set of solution and problem interviews. And so I tell them, well, okay, you're going to go interview 10 people. Tell me by when that's going to happen. And they might say, oh, yeah, I can do this in 2 weeks, or I can do this in a month. And when that month comes by, we actually talk about whether that did happen or didn't happen and why not. So I think innovation accounting, that kind of thinking, that mindset of thinking of time boxing and making those declarations is very helpful right from the ideation stage all the way to the scaling stages. When you think of experiments, even the earliest qualitative experiments are still valid things to go test. Because at the root of that problem, it may be that your customer segment was all wrong, which is why nobody wanted to buy. It could mean, I've been in instances where people have not been able to get a single interview in, and it's because nobody replied back to them. So their channels were really, really ineffective, and that raises a lot of new risks which they have to go address. So I do think it's helpful in using it at all levels. The extent of the tooling changes. So as you launch, the innovation accounting becomes more quantitative. So you look at analytics and metrics and other kinds of things. And in the earlier stages, it's more qualitative, but the thought process is still the same.
Thank you. Okay, another question here from, Michelle. Can you provide examples of how running lean principles can be used to optimize or improve local government processes?
So I would say that for that, I might point you to a number of case studies. Actually, and these videos all went online. So there was a big Lean Startup conference in San Francisco, and Eric did a great job with the last one of showcasing how Lean wasn't just for startups and it wasn't just for high tech. So the first morning of the whole presentation, where people from public, there's a lady from who was using Lean techniques in public schools. We had the CTO of the U.S. government come and do a case study. So I would just point you to that. There are lots of examples. Again, at the principle level, you can take any project and break it down into these meta principles, which is, let me start with what is high risk. Let me stage them out so I can first prove value first at small scale and then scale them out at larger scale. Those are just the bigger principles. But for more specific tactics within those verticals, I would just say, I'd point you to those resources. If you search for Lean Startup Conference 2012, you'll find the videos that I'm talking about.
Thank you. Okay, next question here from Michael. He says, has the Netflix debacle influenced your view of whether to lowball on price when building your market, or would you advocate coming in higher with the thought that you won't anger your early adopters?
Well, so pricing is always considered more art than science. That's why I even use that specific example, is that when I'm initially looking at early adopters, I'm just trying to find a fair ballpark price. I'm not looking to optimize on price. So Netflix is of course, a much latter stage. So I would just say that pricing is always tricky, and there's lots of ways to test. The more important thing is the testing. So even with the way that Netflix introduced their pricing, they could have done it in a more rollout fashion. They could have done other things that may have allowed them to de-risk the fact that people would have this uproar behind them. But just from a general pricing perspective, and if you read my book, you will see that I'm a strong proponent of charging from day one. So I don't believe in discounting to early adopters, because I feel that early adopters are in many ways as visionary as you are. They want to see the product come to life, be brought into the world as much as you do, and they're almost always more than willing to pay the fair price for the product. And figuring what that is more a conversation than it is you saying what it is or they saying what it is. Typically, what I found is that it's higher than what both of you think. And that's just, I guess, all I'll say on that.
Great. Thank you very much. And folks, we did push out to you the URL Ash talked about regarding the Lean Canvas question that came in. So open that group chat if you don't see it. It's right there, the link, so you can go check it out. All right, another question here from Joel. He says, we are a nonprofit who will be developing a MVP for a science lesson planning tool this spring for a pilot in a couple schools. Do you think it's important to run experiments related to developing the landing page for schools and teachers?
Yes, but maybe not immediately. I mean, so one of the things that I also talk a lot about is that the channels becomes a very top risk. So if I was to say the top 3 risks that kind of plague many products, initially it's the problem customer segment identification, and it looks like you've got that. And you've got even a pilot school going, so that's great. You've got some small-scale testing that is going to start soon. So usually it's problem customer segment identification. And then to me, the next thing might be pricing, so figuring out, what is the business model here, and maybe you've had some discussions around that. So those are things, if you haven't, I would encourage at least putting those ballpark pricing on the table so there are no surprises later. These schools don't expect this to be, something that's free or at a different price point than what would make your business model work. And then the third thing, which I rank very high, is the path to customers or channels. So there I would ask is that, yes, beyond these initial pilot customers that you have, how will you reach other schools to come and build awareness about yourself? And so if the answer there is going to be a web channel, then investing in that. So there are 2 parts to that. The first part is that initially you don't need to have a scalable channel. You can go out there and through direct sales channels or through just interviewing customers, you can get the handful of customers you need to start learning, start testing. But the scalable channels can come a little bit later, so that's the good news. The bad news is that scalable channels take a lot of time to sometimes develop and build, so you may have to start some of that testing right now. And so for you, the question would be, if the web is the channel that you're going to drive customers through, then doing those landing page tests might be effective to start doing now. And even using your existing customers to look at them and give you feedback on whether it resonates with them or not would be a good place to just start having some helpful conversation about with even the existing pilot customers. At the same time, it may be that other channels develop that may not be web. So I would just say that it's all that is predicated on the fact that is going to be your scalable channel to go test with.
Let's see here. Another question. Katrin asks, the build, measure, learn cycle focuses on the product. How far can it be applied to the strategy or even the vision?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I would say the build, measure, learn loop it's really this kind of functional lower task of running an experiment. And so it starts with a hypothesis. So it does feed. So it does feed from your vision. So if I was to just kind of take that conceptual framework again, in your vision you may have there may be a belief that, say, busy moms are going to be our customers, and that's who we are going to build this product for, and these are their top problems. Once you identify what's risky, you're basically distilling that down into a set of experiments that you then run. And so it does start from the vision, but the vision has certain assumptions or beliefs behind it, what we call leap of faith assumptions, if I were to use the Randy Komisar kind of terminology. And we take those leap of faiths and we turn them into falsifiable hypotheses. And when you turn them into that falsifiable hypothesis state, you're now going to say, I'm going to run a specific experiment or a specific action to measure whether that belief is true or not. And this is how I'm going to determine that with this expected result. So the experiment is really that manifestation of testing the vision. And you can apply the same thing to the strategy. So if I was building a new social network and I wanted to say, well, is exclusivity really going to work here? I might run an experiment, like in the school example that we just talked about. after I do my initial pilot, I might actually create a contest to say, if you want to be the next school to get access to this tool, come and fill out this contest, and we're going to pick the next one. That kind of creates a level of competition or exclusivity. It may completely backfire, but you know that very quickly, and you decide, okay, that's not the right strategic way to go forward here. So you can test both strategy and vision through experiment.
Perfect. Okay, questions keep coming in. Very good, folks. Keep them coming in. We'll take as many as we have time for. Alrighty, Emilio would like to know, is scaling always a must? Can't we limit the scale stage to a certain level in certain circumstances?
Sure. So I would say scaling, yes. So pursuing growth for growth's sake is almost never the answer. And I oftentimes talk about companies that I now meet that are kind of they're mid-sized companies from the outside. They're very successful. They've got big offices, big teams. But when I talk to the founders or the executive team, they're just not happy because they feel like they are stuck and they can't grow anymore. And a lot of that is predicated on the fact that they didn't really have a clear success metric when they started out. They just hit a product and said, let's just grow this product indefinitely. So I do think that I oftentimes, which is why I start with the why section first with entrepreneurs, is asking them what is their success metric. If you do want to build a $2 million a year business or a $10 million a year business, then once you get it to that level, you don't have to keep growing it. You can kind of maintain it and go do something else. So I don't think scaling is always endless and indefinite, but it needs to stop based on what your definition of success is.
Alrighty, let's see here. Next question from Davinder. I'm a startup mentor. Is your validated learning board a big physical whiteboard where you post index cards? Also, has anyone used gamification techniques to get a startup team to develop the discipline to do it right?
So the answer to the first question is yes, we have these as big boards, and if you also just go to my blog, you'll see some pictures of us using them, and that was the way that we started out. So there are these big posters that we have, and we have Post-it notes, and that's how we use both the canvas as well as the boards. At the same time, once you have geographically distributed teams, which we do as well, the physical boards have the physical limitations. So we've also built these into electronic versions, so you can take so you can have kind of the same Post-it concept but share them more online. So there's both versions of those. As far as the gamification aspect, we've started to experiment with some stuff like that. And I would say that it's a very interesting concept. Of course, it works in many different disciplines, but I'm most intrigued by it because I find that entrepreneurs get very very defocused, and it's just the nature, again, because there's so much uncertainty. There's so many things you can be doing at once. And having the clarity of saying, this is the experiment I need to go run, and I can't do anything else unless I learn something from this experiment, that discipline is absolutely key. So we have been experimenting with some concepts. There may be other people, but none that I publicly know of.
Thank you. Another question here from Kara. She asks, how can you adapt the running lean model to nonprofit work?
Sure. So I would say that at the fundamental level, I would say there's not much difference. Irrespective of the kind of product you're building, there's going to be a success metric at the end. So in your case, it's not going to be profit, which is what drives a lot of the for-profit world. It's margins and how can we squeeze as much margin as possible. But there's going to be another success metric. And so in the revenue stream section on the canvas, rather than highlighting and emphasizing that as a key metric, there may be something else. It may be social good or some other measure that you're using, which ideally it shouldn't just be an intangible thing. It should be something you can measure. And if you can craft it in such a way that it does become a measurable metric, then you can apply these same techniques to build your company, build your product, the brand, towards achieving that.
Great, and we'll end here with this final question from Gernot. He or she asks, Ash, regarding the tools to measure certain metrics on a website, do you have any recommendations? And what do you think about Google Analytics?
Sure. So I think that there's different kinds of measurements. There is the pre-acquisition type stuff. So what I mean by that is if you have a pure website, then tools like Google Analytics are great. We use them every single day. There's other variants of those. We use a combination of Google Analytics and Clicky, or I think it's called getclicky.com. And so it adds some additional things to it. For split testing, we use things like Optimizely and Visual Website Optimizer. So that's all stuff on the marketing website. If you have customers and they go behind the login screen, then you have to measure their life cycle over time, and there are more challenges there. And so again, in those videos links that I shared with you, I do share a tool that we have built, but more importantly, I share certain principles behind how to measure them. So whether you are building your own tool or you are using some other tool, there are some good ideas there if you're building a software product on how to deal with metrics and how to measure those kinds of things. So I recommend watching those videos as well.
Super. And I'm not seeing any additional questions come in. So Ash, as we close out the event, is there anything additionally you'd like to leave the audience with today?
No, I think So the key message I wanted to say there is that once you craft that initial vision of yours, the next critical step is getting down to that number one risk and that focus. Focus is absolutely key. So distilling it down to that number one risk, and there are various ways to get at that. There are some of the things I shared with you today, but even just having conversations with people like potential advisors, with customers, those risks start to surface. And once you identify that, the next big challenge is figuring out this concept of the MVP or the experiment. What is that smallest thing you can build so that it's done in days or weeks versus months, so that you can go validate whether that risk is really a risk and how you mitigate that. So those would be like the summary of what the key message I wanted to share with you today. And thanks everyone for being on.
Ash, thank you so much for presenting today's webcast for us, for sharing all your knowledge and expertise. We really do appreciate your time.
Right, thanks, Yasmina.
Folks that attended, thank you so much for attending our webcast today, and we hope you benefited from it. And those of you that sent in your questions, thank you so much for the questions, because having those questions just really adds that much more to our event. So thank you for that. We'd like to let you all know we have an excellent deal for you all today for attending the event. Ash's book is available to you all at a really, really great price. So we've got the Running Lean book on O'Reilly.com. Excellent price for you all. We pushed out a code to save you some money there. So judging by all the comments in the group chat, a lot of you have already checked it out, bought it, and are enjoying it and applying those principles. So to those of you that are considering it, please take a look at it. If you like what you heard today from Ash, you need to get the book and really start getting your business to where it needs to be. Folks, thank you again. Thank you, Ash. This will conclude our webcast. Goodbye, everybody.